Keats died in Rome, where he went in hopes of curing his tuberculosis. His gravestone is an interesting artifact and ironic and sad, but it indicates how remote the idea of success was for Keats during his lifetime, success as a poet. His intent for the gravestone was that these words would be written there. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. But his friends, who I'm sure meant well, I think were quite misguided, added words of explanation that buttress this idea, this sort of myth that grew up around Keats, that he was killed by those bad reviews that he received, that his reception in the English literary press was so cruel and punishing. And you have the review of Lockhart uh, on the Cockney poets to look at, to get an idea of the cruelty and character assassination that involved. So a kind of myth grew up around Keats that he was kind of destroyed by the bad reviews. Shelley also wrote an elegy in which he suggested a similar story. But what's ironic and I think poignant, that his own friends felt the need to kind of excuse Keats's own intention for his gravestone. This grave contains all that was mortal of a young English poet who on his deathbed, in the bitterness of his heart, at the malicious power of his enemies, desired these words to be engraven on his tombstone. So kind of an undermining words to put on his gravestone for all eternity. But it really goes to show, I think, Keats's status and the status he held even in the eyes of those around him. How evident it was to them, not just that he was a failure as a poet, but that he was consumed with resentment about his failure and bitterness in his heart. And moreover, his friends, it's remarkable to me that they were not able to see the affirmative aspect of what Keats writes here. They saw it just as an expression of bitterness. But as I've already hopefully suggested a little bit, this idea of anonymity, losing oneself as a possessive individual or, an agent of conquest in order to find oneself in an environmental resonance, this sort of wild surmise, or the way in which Keats dissolves into the trellis of a working brain, sort of the architecture of a temple in Ode to Psyche, losing his identity in a kind of formal patterning, and losing himself especially in the fairy fancy, the old dame's tale, the whim of Madeline in St. Agnes Eve, the fantasy of the marginalized, the anonymous, even the fantasy of the beadsman. That's how that poem ends, with the beadsman in his ashes cold. I think the idea of losing himself in patterns and rhythms of his poetic imagination is a really profound and dear one to Keats. So it's kind of astonishing how misunderstood his idea for his own epitaph was. So let's look here at the Chameleon Poet letter, where he fleshes out this idea of the selflessness of the poet. The chameleon poet is absorbed by his poetic creations. He contrasts this idea to what he calls the Wordsworthian or egotistical sublime, which is a thing per se and stands alone. Keats is not a thing per se, does not stand alone, but reverberates. He finds himself as an effect, that's to say, always in movement, interactive, animated. This is what he means by gusto. It lives in gusto. It's not anything to be evaluated in static terms, foul or fair, high or low, rich or poor, mean or elevated. Keats thinks of identity not as something stable to hold on to understand, an essential identity, but as a rhythm of interaction, much like those ripples on water. He suggests that kind of rhythm here in the close of this letter. I feel assured I should write from the mere yearning and fondness I have for the beautiful, even if my night's labor should be burnt every morning, and no eye ever shine upon them. That same sort of self evaporation, but living in the provisional moment, always transitory, always fleeting, animated by passion or spirit that moves beyond any particular statement. So he continues, but even now I'm perhaps not speaking from myself, but from some character in whose soul I now live. Keats's Ode to a Nightingale acts out this kind of exorbitant empathy, sort of like the night in La Belle Dame sans Merci, loses himself, is completely disoriented by his infatuation with the fairy. Similar infatuation with the night, disorienting infatuation with the nightingale. It's described here. So there's an interesting kind of distorted or syntax in this first stanza. He begins by saying he's numbed and achy, as if he'd emptied an opiate or hemlock and sunk into the river of forgetting or death. And then he continues to, it's not because of envy. It's not because he's addressing the bird. I'm not envious of your happiness, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light winged dryad of the trees. He begins with this explanation, like it's not for this reason, but for this reason. So you expect him to say that so he's explaining himself. It is not through envy, it's not because of envy, but it's because I'm too happy. That he leads you to expect that he's going to talk, say something about himself there. But so he really acts out here in this very construction of this sentence here, that self-forgetting, that loss, and fantastical, exorbitant empathizing with the bird. It's obviously beautiful writing. It's writing about singing, but it's self distorting. His sense of himself is getting lost, His voice is detached from his self in the same way the voice of the night is detached from himself. He's not coherently represented in his words. So in a way, it's the opposite of singing in full-throated ease that Keats is acting out here. The poem ends by contrasting different experiences of time. He describes the bird as immortal. Why is that? What makes the bird immortal? Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears mid the alien corn. The same that oft times hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairylands forlorn. The same song is heard in ancient times, in the time of the Bible, and in the time of fairy tales. It's a song that isn't treaded down by hungry generations. Distinctions of history, mechanical progress, history as measured by the calendar. Each generation sort of hungry to distinguish itself. That same principle of egotism, But the bird stands apart, the song stands apart from history. That sense of immortality is constructed by Keats, thinking of it in contrast to these other generations. So the generations may tread Keats down, but he can imagine this song that sounded the same for all these other generations, from all these other perspectives. But this is a poem of, like the La Belle Dame sans Merci, of flying too close to the sun, feeling too clingy or possessive of this immortality he imagines. And he stumbles on a kind of Freudian slip. So it's like he's trying to maintain a kind of balance or rhythm in his relationship to the immortal. You know, it's an arrangement of time that he's imagining the bird and his reaction to the bird, and then these other perspectives on the bird, and trying to hold them in a kind of sustainable rhythm. But he loses that rhythm and sort of trips up on this. He makes a kind of Freudian slip when he throws off this word forlorn. And then he's like, oh shit, that's me. I'm forlorn. That calls me back to myself. I've lost this resonant configuration of my imagination and sensation, have sort of fallen out of their rhythm. And so this final stanza describes a disorientation, confusion, akin to that of the night at the end of La Belle Dame sans Merci. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? So I think Keats is all about trying to find appropriate distance to the object of desire, to keep it at an appropriate distance, rather than getting too tightly identified with it, flying too close to the sun, getting absorbed by it, and losing his sense of himself. So his sense of himself comes from the the elaboration of frustration or dissatisfaction that keeps it at a distance. And it really comes down to the music of the language. This is a nihilistic statement, but it's poetically nihilistic. Whose name was writ in water. It ripples off your tongue. Another example of what I mean. So I think in this is a sonnet that's full of negations. It's like, this is a sonnet not about what you think bright star means. So I wish I were like a bright star, but not. He gives us all these ways in which what he wants is not at all like a bright star, or not what you would expect from a bright star. And that is the kind of magical, too accessible. I feel like he's like Jane Austen in this way, that true love has to be kind of born of disappointment, that a direct access of love is always deceptive. So it's sustainable happiness is a matter of arriving at a kind of fatalism and appreciation of these larger patterns of desire, larger patterns of inevitable disappointment. I mean, it doesn't even have to be evaluated. It's just that life always plays out differently than you expect. And it plays out in more detail. And that's the same thing with poetry, is in a lot of ways it's saying the same story, but in ever new detail. I mean, it's like music. The point is really exercising the poem, or being exercised by the poem, just like in the same way. Music is kind of cathartic. This is a lot like Ode to Psyche, and that Keats is taking a kind of austere religious symbol or ritual act of devotion and totally animating it with the body. So he's sort of saying, I'm making my symbol of eternity the living body, the breathing body. I can't help thinking of Keats's tuberculosis and that, tuberculosis that killed his brother and mother. Its association with breathing. This, the rhythm of breathing is so vivid. I mean, it's the medium of this embodied feeling of eternity that Keats describes. So it's going to begin, as in the Elgin Marble Sonnet, evoking this austere, eternal grandeur, cold in its perfection and timelessness. But then it's for the sake of sort of relishing his mortality, the mortal body, the animation of breathing experience. It's thrown in deeper relief, more intense relief. The poem draws us into the rhythm of breathing and the rhythm of embodiment and invites us to think steadfastness at the same time. Like, think this term that we normally associate, eternity, permanence, in time with the body, is resonant with the body, and acknowledge, like with anything else, that life only happens in the present, and whatever we think about steadfastness, we think about it from the perspective of our mortal bodies. And he's just, so the poem becomes a way of just feeling really at home in the embodied thought of a steadfastness, rather than feeling alienated, rather than feeling your body's alienated from it. I think these repetitions of still, repeated 4 times, is really lovely, because that word itself contains both dimensions of the eternal, like still, stopped, unchanging, permanent, eternal. But still also means continuing, like still, especially when it's repeated, means continuing in the moment. It's still going.
Pillared upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft swell and fall, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still, still to hear her tender taken breath.
I was talking last time about this idea of making your wound expressive, communicating pain just for the sake of the pleasure and community entailed by communication. Well, Ode to Melancholy, literally an ornament, a trophy of that. It finds such pleasure in the elaborate overwriting of the wish to die in the first stanza, becomes an occasion for the most ornate and sensational poeticizing. Yeah, he continues to kind of deconstruct melancholy, even as it's supposedly an ode to melancholy, and turns it into the most intense kind of pleasure by virtue of the way he describes it. But the very describing becomes a kind of transformation, transfiguration, just relishing the details. That's what I meant by saying that it's not that every narrative is bound to failure, or that all your intentions will fail, but the just way in which life plays out will always be different from what you expect or intend. And Keats is sort of acknowledging that abundance. And even when we decide the narrative's over and I want to end it, he's just showing how rich the ways are of saying even that, and noticing the experience of it. So When the melancholy fit shall fall sudden like heaven from a weeping cloud, that fosters the droop-headed flowers all, and hides the green hill in an April shroud, then glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or in a rainbow of the salt sand wave, or on the wealth of globed peonies. Or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand and let her rave, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. So he's saying relish the details even of melancholy, because I mean it's the same point that we've sort of traced in all these romantics, that this judgmental binary sort of success fail, happiness depression is oversimplifying, and that paying attention to the details unfolds something more rich than whatever narrative resolution we might want to put to things. And so he's calling us to attention, even, you know, the idea of suicide or melancholy is way more interesting in the actual details of how it plays out than any conclusive story that we could tell about it. And so again, it's like a rhythm that he's trying to evoke. It's really a relationship to desire, keeping this balanced distance. This very subtle temporality that he's evoking here, but it's certainly a temporality, a rhythm of desire and frustration that's getting measured out in this last stanza. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy whose hand is ever at his lips, bidding adieu, and aching pleasure nigh, turning to poison while the bee-mouth sips. Aye, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. His soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. It's interesting. I think what Keats is describing here is something a lot like what Wordsworth is describing at the end of Nutting. It's sort of this description of climax in a way, like this moment where beauty or fulfillment and its opposite, or like the next moment after fulfillment, it's like immediately kind of a loss. This pattern of coming and going is, you know, integral to the experience of desire. So he comes around in the last stanza to show that, you know, melancholy is actually the secret of absolute bliss. You know, within this inevitable dialectic, disappointment is just the other side of beauty, bliss, everything you want. Enjoying precisely this kind of rhythm, the sensuous aspect of this rhythm, burst joyous grape, like just that moment of anticipation. I mean, he's kind of saying that bliss and disappointment are effectively the same thing. Like the moment of anticipation of fulfillment is inevitably gives way to the next moment, which is something else. But Keats is elaborating this temporality or this rhythm of desire and disappointment in such a lavish, ornate way that he makes it, you know, a pleasure unto itself. So that exceeds, it has a value above and beyond its narrative story. This poem reminds me of Blake in a way, because it's just about the symmetry of delight and melancholy, joy and melancholy, just sort of the conceptual binary of the two. And like a Blake poem, Keats sort of deconstructs the binary by bringing it to life and to showing kind of embodied mediation of these conceptual symmetries and drawing us into also a poetic mediation, the rhythm of the words. But it's amazingly sensational, you know, very very intense, emotional, and it's pretty erotic. It's a pretty sexy poem, I'd say. So it's amazing the contrast with what you might expect to ode to melancholy. It's a tour de force of chameleon poetry. It's like a showstopper. You know, I started out talking about Keats's negative capability letter and how that's was inspired by theater. And I think this is a real theatrical poem. It's really showing the, you know, dramatic power of his poetry. It's high octane. So it's interesting to notice the contrast to a Wordsworth poem like Nutting. I mean, because this boils down to the same scenario. Like, it's about seeing desire and it's inevitable disappointment. I think, you know, this is also about, you know, chasing a kind of eroticized fantasy. But this is the conclusion is just pain here. But it's the same kind of rhythm that's getting described, you know. I mean, this is really amazing. He says, before from the mutilated bower I turned, exulting, rich beyond the wealth of kings, I felt a sense of pain when I beheld the silent trees. Before he exulted, he felt the pain. It's like the pain crosses temporality. The narrative of exaltation, it's there, but it's already reframed by the pain of regret. Anyways, it's a, you know, it's a complicated emotional rhythm that's getting described there, like Keats is doing here. This is just so austere and punishing. It's such a stark, yeah, deflation or, you know, inversion of the pleasure into pain. Whereas Keats makes a kind of pleasure out of the interplay, the that temporal confusion is part of the pleasure of the poem. The odes on a Grecian urn and to autumn are Keats's most celebrated poems and commonly thought among the best in the language. And I think that's for the reason I was just talking about in Ode to Melancholy, that Keats is able in these poems to give a harrowing, palpable sense of disappointment and mortality on the one hand, but equally to incorporate this in the expression of a embodied emotional rhythm that's affirmative and joyous. The Ode on a Grecian Urn begins with several features that we've been studying. First off, this series of questions, it's inviting us into a mystery. These questions open up the possibility of the poem, not knowing the answers. And this not knowing is also an invitation into something like a family relationship, a relationship to the unravaged bride of quietness, the foster child of slow time. It's a quasi wedding or adoption. These are the kinds of relationships that Keats is suggesting to the urn. Opening ourselves to this mystery, to a relationship to the urn that's not about objective knowledge, not about answering these questions, but exploring their mysteries, prepares something like a wedding or something like an adoption, a family. This first stanza celebrates its own pleasure, its own. It's these questions are ironic. He's not even looking for answers. He's celebrating mystery by ironically tossing out questions he knows he'll get no answer to and wants no answer to before he even poses the question. He refers to the urn as a sylvan historian, that is like historian of the forest, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than a rhyme. So he already knows that the information, the history, the urn has to teach will not be reducible to the language of his rhyme. Yet he asks these questions as if relishing that impossibility. So again, the kind of excess pleasure in poetry itself, the gratuitous excess, celebrating its own impotence, its own fraudulence, its own lack of knowledge. This is an affirmation and demonstration of just what we've been tracing in the other poems of Keats, a persistence, a steadfastness of the body itself, the emotions and the imaginations in relation to otherworldly ideas of long time, eternity. If the Ode to Melancholy uses, an image like bursting joy's grape on your palate fine, or melancholy, even in the temple of delight, has her sovereign shrine. These images teach us to relish or show us a relishing, an active relishing in the language itself of the rhythm of desire. Part of what's amazing about the Grecian urn and the Ode to Autumn is that they extend this narrative of desire, the cycle of anticipation growing to a kind of climax, and then a post-climactic kind of awareness of mortality and the transitoriness of everything. These middle three stanzas in the Ode to Grecian Urn, and then the three stanzas of To Autumn, take us through our paces, take us through the paces of this cycle of desire. The Grecian Urn takes us through the moods of these various stages along this trajectory, and he's led by the imagery on the urn. Sees an image of musicians, lovers beneath a tree, and then an image of sacrifice. So the Ode on a Grecian Urn and Keats generally are sometimes misread as celebrating a kind of Platonic idealism, the timeless, eternal beauty of the urn, the cold pastoral. But you can understand why these lines, such as these initial lines of the second stanza, might be read as an idealist statement. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit, ditties of no tone. In contrast to the Nightingale Ode, Keats here says that he prefers not to hear the music, prefers to imagine what this ancient music might have been, prefers to keep the object of desire at a certain distance, not as a restriction, but in order precisely to relish anticipation all the more, to relish that moment of pressing joy's grape against your palate. It says the same thing about the kiss, the unkissed kiss, the moment of framing, anticipating the object of desire. He says that of the music, it plays not to the sensual ear, but more endeared. So more in, like inner ear, more to the in ear, but also the dear ear. He's teaching himself what to value in sensuous experience. That's what anticipation is for, is to focus on what you want from experience. And you do that by keeping the object a little bit at a distance. So he's relishing the stage, but it's only a stage, and it's important to notice how it very clearly gives way to this kind of orgasmic stage of happy, 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 where he's just kind of gushing climactically, and then this is followed by return to questioning. This is mysterious pleasure, mysterious enthusiasm, but this mysterious doubt and questioning follows that moment of climax. In Autumn, what's amazing is there's no narrative packaging. He draws his story just out of the symbolism of nature itself, of natural objects. So Keats evokes this sense of anticipation by imagining autumn playing a kind of conspiracy, a kind of trick on nature, tricking nature into thinking that summer will never end. And he evokes rather powerfully, I think, this kind of anticipatory swelling, engorging to the point almost of bursting. The second climactic stanza is unmistakably mellow, certainly compared to the climactic stanza in Ode on a Grecian Urn. But it's equally unmistakably luxurious, especially this powerful word oozings, this endless oozing, sort of dissolving. Keats is relishing, perhaps in a masochistic way, his submission to the cold and cruel inescapability of death, so clearly evoked here as the gleaner. The leaden head of death, observing with patient look the last oozings, always reminds me of a cat. The sort of the way, the indifferent coldness with which a cat looks at a mouse that it's toying with. Keats is clearly relishing that coldness, that the last oozings, hours by hours, he's turning that last moment. He's transforming time, the measure of time into a measure of his own pleasure. So the last stanza really amazingly evokes this eternal interplay of life and death, the rhythm of being born and dying, blooming and mourning. And this rhythm is evoked in the atmosphere, the winds holding the insects aloft, borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. The lambs bleating, the hilly born, these sounds of nature, these rhythms of the environment, finally articulated through sort of rich patterning of nature imagery, and then ultimately in this onomatopoeia, the sound of swallows twitter in the skies. So, like the lambs bleating, Keats is finally giving us, a song of ourselves, a song in which we can affirm, celebrate, enjoy the sheer communication and expression of who we are, in our awareness of our mortality and these interminable cycles of life, as a music we can believe in rather than evade, suppress in various kinds of knowing. We saw how the Ode on a Grecian Urn began with these images of the proto-family, the unconsummated love, or, the less than fully assimilated child. But these are replaced by the end of the poem with the bond of friendship, a friend to man. And I think that's what the song finally is, a medium of social bonding,